let me stop yammering and give the rest of the time over to Dr. Jim Munsch, who's going to talk to us about grazing economics, which sounds really dry and boring, but I saw him talk about this at Vernon County Conservation Days last Friday. It was the last Friday or the Friday before, it doesn't matter. It was a week or two ago. And he did it in person, and it was highly engaging and super exciting. There were Amish farmers in the back of the room jumping up and asking questions in the middle of it. They were so excited about the numbers that Jim was sharing. So I just am thrilled that he's going to share with us today. So take it away, Jim.
Okay. Carl, am I set to go for a screen share?
Yeah, you should be good to go.
Okay. I always get a little, okay, share. Got it. So you all are seeing my screen, presumably, huh?
Yep.
Looks good, yep.
So this meeting we had was on the farm of, I would guess 50-ish something fellow who had grown up on that farm, which was a dairy farm. His dad retired. He started renting it out for corn and bean people. And he could not live with the erosion that happened on the farm and started thrusting around for other things to do with the land. And he finally decided that he would convert the whole thing into pasture and use his animal husbandry skills to make money off of that pasture. So he came to it with full animal science background and practice. What he probably wasn't as good at is the economic part of it, but his wife is a loan officer for Compure. And so the economics were injected into the decision making. But it was 120 acres, 125 acres of cropland and maybe 25, 30 acres of permanent pasture, converted all to grazing. And he got the Conservationist of the Year award a couple of years ago. They were just celebrating now because of COVID. Anyway, I was supposed to speak at this, the local land and water guy and I kind of put our heads together, and we both recognized that this economic issue keeps rearing its head when people are thinking about converting land out of crops to pasture. So we thought that would be a good subject. And it really put the push on me to bring together things I've been thinking about for 30 years. and so we did that for that. Unfortunately for you, in a way, the venue was supposed to be in a shed in the middle of the pasture where there was no electricity. So I was relieved from the trauma of doing a PowerPoint. So what I did was I put 4 charts together, put them on a piece of paper, and it was really, I think, Randy, you might smile or frown, whatever, but I think it was pretty effective because it kept people glued on what I was saying, not what was written on the screen. So I've incorporated those 4, put a few fancy, fluffy shots around it here for you all, but mainly we're just going to talk a lot. Not unusual for me. So if you look at this conversion, we all like to talk about the sort of anthropological, the people's, the societal part of it. We like to talk about the environmental part of it, and a lot of the research that you all are doing is in the environmental part of it. And then there is the economic part. If you think about those 3 domains and think of a Venn diagram, I didn't use that analogy with the Amish. The intersection of those 3 is where you can tip somebody over to do this conversion. And each of those is sort of in the eye of the beholder. They have to be comfortable that all of those are solved. What experience, and Gene, you can chime in on this too, what experience says is that there's a couple of those domain creatures besides economics, pure economics, a couple of them that have some traction. One is the skills and interests and capabilities in animal science, because with pasture, you have to have animals. And that's one small traction piece. The other is erosion. People like the Parrs, whose farm we were on, have been on the land a long time. They revere the land. And when they rent the land out to somebody who causes ditches to form on their property, they're upset about it. And that's exactly what brought the Parrs to this, and many other people that I've run into. Gene, I'm sure you're the same way. One small piece, Margaret, that I should say is that CSP, the Conservation Security Program, has been rejiggered somehow. And there's some reasonable amount of government money that can be brought to the table if you're doing something as soil saving as managed grazing. So aside from those things out of the realm of economics, there is an economic aspect to those things. Certainly, soil erosion has an economic aspect. And so one thing I find is that very few landowners or producers really understand what they're doing to their land with what the land use is right now. And so I ask, this is really cool stuff here and will be part of Grayscape eventually and be even cooler. But Monique Hassman, Dr. Monique Hassman works at our local Land and Water and also for Valley Stewardship Network. With the help of Wallace, the Pasture Project, and Eric's group at the university, they've put together a spreadsheet form of what amounts to SNAP Plus, Russell 2 and SNAP Plus, which predicts soil loss on certain farms. Now, let me stop here. This is very location centric, this whole discussion. And it comes from a sort of a strong view I have that farmers are artists, and they take, like an artist takes color, they take science, they take things that people at universities work on and researchers work on, and they put them together in a picture, in a beautiful picture, or maybe not such a beautiful picture, but a picture. One of the big inputs to making that picture is the land that they sit on. And so a lot of this is very site specific. And so, and oh, by the way, some of these pictures are beautiful and some of them aren't so beautiful. And some of them in today's agriculture are almost like paint by numbers. But managed grazing is not paint by numbers. It requires some management capability, so artistic capability, if you will. So anyway, site specific, Vernon and Crawford County, we have a lot of silt loam up on the ridges, Pepin, Seton, silt loam soils. A lot of our slopes are in the 6 to 20% range. That's for the people in this. This is C and D slope land. A typical legacy land use was a dairy rotation with spring tillage. And I'm talking specifically with modern spring tillage, that is vertical tillage, and no cover crops. That was a very typical land use. So what this chart says is if you were doing that practice and wanted to change to managed grazing, how much soil would you save? Tons per acre per year. If you were doing that rotation, these tools that are based on Russell 2 and SNAP Plus says that you would lose 8.6 tons of soil per acre per year. And you'd lose down into the streams and other places 11 pounds of phosphorus per year. If you use cover crops, you'd reduce that a couple tons. Now, this is interesting. On the farms that were legacy farms, there's always a lot of permanent pasture. If you used a high density approach to that permanent pasture, that is just put a lot of animals on it all summer, you would have soil loss above T. T is tolerable soil loss. T is 5 tons per acre out here in our neck of the woods. You'd lose more than that off of permanent pasture with high density grazing. Randy, this is the one that you picked up on during the meeting.
So this is, we often refer to this as continuous grazing.
Continual, yep. Set stock is a word in the beef industry we use. Yep. It's place more than crop. It's a place. It's a place to put animals, basically.
And Jim, just let me interrupt, while I'm interrupting,
sure.
Let me interrupt one more time. Can you, for context, tell us how many dump trucks handle a ton of soil, or 2 tons, or whatever that is?
I use this all the time, and I hesitate to use it around scientists because the bulk density changes with the different soil types, but
don't bother us with the facts.
Yeah, a dump truck will haul 15 cubic yards of material. And my guess is that you guys tell me how many tons of soil is in a cubic yard?
No, we never deal with yards, so it's going to take some calculations.
Maybe it's 2 or 3 dump trucks, or 2 dump trucks. I'm sorry, half a dump truck maybe.
For a ton?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh no, for 8 tons.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So anyway, it's a lot of soil, and so if and this is sort of the history of this area. Everybody then, as they got out of dairy, they went to cash grain, and they said they were doing no-till, and they were not using cover crops. These algorithms would say that they would lose 2 tons of soil per acre. But all of us that live out here know that this calculation is incorrect for our area. Whether it's incorrect generally, and somebody at NRCS or wherever these numbers are made should look at it, is another subject, but it's incorrect for our areas because we have short rows, hilly, very hilly topography, and typically 100% of the time, in order to plant on every acre, they plant up and down the hill at the end rows. Over time, waterways go to heck, and they plant up and down the hill next to waterways. And so it's the idea that the cash grain in my part of the world has a lower soil loss than even permanent pasture is crazy. Anyway, that's just my harangue on that. Permanent pasture that is low density, you drop way down, because you've got the grass cover. And there's a lot of people who faced with the bad tax consequences of not using pasture on a farm that no longer has any animals, that are willing to rent pasture, permanent pasture, low density, out to anybody that has animals just to save the taxes. And if you want to understand that math, I know it, but it's not appropriate right here. The bottom line down there is that the weighted average of erosion, and I'll explain weighted average, with managed grazing is 0.0064 tons per acre per year. Laura Payne has a slide that shows the side of field measurement of soil loss on managed grazing, and it's even less than that. This comes from one of the discovery farms, with a P loss less than a pound a year. I'm not a scientist, but my understanding is that Mother Nature can build soil faster than 0.0064 tons per acre. So this form of land use ends up being accretive, that is contributing to soil. All of the rest, with the possible exception of very low density permanent pasture, is losing soil faster than it can be created. That brings us to the economic aspect of this, but it's a hard economic aspect for a farmer to understand. The economic aspect is that this is, in economic terms, the degradation of an asset. And will it happen over the lifespan of a farmer, a landowner? And does it make any difference? Land prices continue to go up, 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 regardless of how we trash the soil. And so from a societal standpoint, it's a looming disaster because no soil and no food. But from the farmer's perspective, it just makes him feel bad. You can't draw an economic conclusion from it unless you convert it to managed grazing and get a payment from the government for doing it. And which I have, in all honesty, and it's nice. Okay, so let's talk about pasture. Pasture 80 years ago, as I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is a book put out by John Deere, of all people, in 1938, the year I was born. And it says, pasture, a paying crop. Okay, what the heck has happened is that through a lot of advice from various people in economics, we have done what you see on the left. We have taken pasture out of pasture, put it into crops, except for those areas that are just so gnarly and so nasty that they can't be used for crops. And we put animals on them, and that right there is extensive, or whatever we called it before, extensive use of permanent pasture. And that doesn't hold soil. On the right is a crop. That's a real crop of grass. But so we could say, let's start measuring the economic value of a crop, just like we measure the economic value of any crop. But there's a problem, and there's a few problems. One of the problems is that when we graze through adaptive management, adaptive paddock size, moved cattle, managed grazing, we are not only providing a crop, but we're providing a bit of a place to consume food, to cycle nutrients. And in fact, if you drew a boundary around your pasture, and if all these cattle, if Mother Nature would spread all these cattle out like they are on these pictures of my place, the only nutrients that would come off of this place, because erosion is reduced to almost nothing, which is a loss of nutrients. Nutrients that go into the air are still lost, but you can replace them with legumes, that is nitrogen. And phosphorus and potash just stay right there. And so cycle nutrients is the second most important thing that happens in a pasture. Consuming feed, using it to build body, to raise calves, to get rebred, to have calves on pasture is the place element. And cycling nutrients is an economic benefit because it mitigates or eliminates the need for fertilizer on a well-managed pasture. So how do you look at a crop? Every land-grant college in the United States, probably a lot of other entities, have crop budgets. A crop budget, the ones that I like the most are from Iowa State University, start at the top as it's a profit and loss statement for the crop per acre. Yield is taken times price times yield equals revenue. That's the top line. Then you have input costs, both obvious input costs and not so obvious input costs. Obvious input costs are seed, fertilizer, lime. Those are obvious input costs. Not so obvious input costs are the running of machinery, the fuel, the maintenance, and the cost of owning the machinery, overhead of the farm that supports the use of the machinery, the storage bin that takes the crop afterwards, etc. That's the true way of looking at the cost of a crop. You take revenue from the crop and take input costs away from it, and you end up with profit. And that's usually expressed on a per acre basis. There are separately animal budgets in these same halls of ivy that look at it at the cost of raising or having one animal, one calf, one feeder, one, et cetera, et cetera. They use crops as an input. A problem there is that the measurements of the crops that go into an animal budget are set up to reflect the crop budgets. And there are no good crop budgets for pastures, my opinion. They have some budgets that show the cost of renovating, the cost of establishment, but no budgets as we have other crop budgets. So what it boils down to is that pasture doesn't fit the crop format easily. And there are 4 issues. One is variability of yield. And let's take a look at that. This is a really cool app that Elisa Chasen, I just call her Elisa, so I screw her last name up all the time. So Lisa put together, it is, and anybody that's done pasture planning will recognize exactly the data. This also, so what this shows is that there is extreme variability in pasture yield caused from soils, fertility, the species of plants that you're growing, and the management. So if you look at this, these predictions are in the app, and I encourage you to go look at it. It's really slick. You pick the soil that's on your farm and the slope that is attendant to that soil nomenclature. And a table pops up that says, if you move cattle every day or less than one day, and if you have low yielding variety grasses, you could expect 4 tons per acre of dry matter off of that pasture with that soil. And I won't go through all the numbers because you understand these numbers. The startling thing to most producers is that when you go from moving less than 1 day to 7 days or continual grazing, you drop the yield almost in half. Not quite, drop it about 40%, 50%. And this is a rich conversation when you're standing with a producer who says, I've got a job off farm. I'm not gonna be able to move my cows more than 5, 7 or every week. I can only move them once a week. And you can say, okay, that's cool, but here's what you can get if you move them every day. I've been through this. We move cattle every day, and we do it to get greater yield, to carry more animals on the same amount of land. It's just that simple. So this is one problem about this crop, quote, crop. Let's see. Come now. So let's talk about these last 3 things, and we'll just talk about it without showing any pictures. So pay attention. yield is a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around with a pasture. The yields that I showed you before are total amount of dry matter that grows up from the ground over the course of the year in managed grazing. But all of that yield is not, quote, harvested by the animal. And so it makes it difficult to define what yield really is, how much actually goes into an animal's mouth, and how to measure it. And I made a nice little joke that the Amish liked, and that is that if we could invent cows with meters on their mouth, we might be able to tell how much they're getting. So the whole yield thing, it's sort of, in my mind, from an economic standpoint, it bifurcates into two different ways to measure yield. One is what we put in our predictive tools. The heifer decision making tool that John Hendrickson and Connor and Brad and I are working on uses the first method. The first method is you take the yield available, you make a discount for what is not consumed, and you assume the rest of it is consumed by the animal and becomes true yield. And that's how you balance the number of cattle with the number of acres. This is orthodoxy in Wisconsin with pasture planners. That's how they do it. But there's another leg, and that is to back around the subject of measuring the yield. Truly measuring it on your farm is to back into it. And this is extremely common in areas that have a lot of grazing farms. And in fact, rent is often paid by animal unit month, which is how much would a 1,000-pound animal unit consume in 1 month. And so when I did a little survey of some farms, some grass-fed beef farms, this is exactly how I estimated yield. So you take how many pounds of animals are grazed over what amount of time over what area of pasture, and you assume that those animals consume 2.5% to 3% of their body weight every day. You do all the cranky math, and you back into how much that herd of animals consumed totally, divided by the number of acres, is the consumed yield per acre. That's that bifurcation. This is used not as a predictive tool often, but as a management tool looking back. But when we look at animal requirements in pasture planning, we do use this system. We say exactly, how many animals do you plan to graze? What is their average weight? They will consume 3% of that weight every day. Over how long do you think you'll graze? And then we have a big argument about stretching that out. And we come up with an animal requirement. And we match this to this theoretical yield that we calculated before. And that's the balance that around which we design our pasture systems. So much different than measuring the number of bushels that come off an acre of corn. Or, for that matter, the number of tons of hay that comes off a hayfield. And then finally, the thing if you look at the formula above, in a traditional crop budget, they easily overcome the concept of yield. Yield is measured in the wagon or the truck, the forage wagon that goes off of the field. You weigh a couple of those, you kind of get an idea what they are, what the tare weight is, that is just the weight of the stuff in the wagon. And then you just multiply it times the wagons or bales, or a lot of combines will tell you in great detail how many bushels of corn or beans that you get off the field. That's easy. Price is easy in the case of all those commodities because there is a market for them. The market is rather stable for corn and beans, either organic or not organic. Stable for oats, you can call the local elevator and figure out what that is. Hay is not quite so stable, it bounces all over the place, but there's markets for it and you can figure out what that is. Not so with pasture. And so that does not fit the common crop budget. And that's the reason universities don't make crop budgets, good crop budgets for pasture. And it's the reason that we don't call pasture a crop, because it doesn't fit the mold, my jaded opinion. So this is sort of a dense chart, but what it tries to do is it tries to make a financial comparison of corn silage, hay, and managed grazing, given all of the difficulties of measuring these things. And I'll show you how I handled each. In this rack up, there's no owner's labor charged and there's no land cost. And I'll cycle back at the end about how I look at how you account for the cost of land. There are, let me see how many, 416, I think, farms that contribute data for dry hay, alfalfa dry hay, in a database called FinBin. FinBin is populated by data that is submitted by people who use a farm planning program called FinPac. All of that is administered by the University of Minnesota. So I looked at 416 farms in that database that in 2020 raised alfalfa hay, dry hay. Their average yield in terms of dry matter was 3.8 tons per acre. The cash expense, not including land, this is literally what you write checks for. No depreciation of machinery, etc. $66 per ton of dry matter. Now, with alfalfa, if you assume that alfalfa stand will last 3 years, the first year before you start that 3-year period is the establishment year, in which you input a lot of seed, fertilizer, planting time, land prep, etc. And you get very little out that first year. You maybe get an oats crop, you maybe get some straw, maybe you get some forage. So you have to amortize that input cost over the 3 years where you're actually getting crops out. That has to be added to the cost. So if you add that in, you're at about $90 on these 416 farms. You're about at $90 total cash cost harvested in the harvest year.
Hey, Jim,
Yeah.
This is Rod. I got a quick question on your yields per ton. Is that per cutting or assuming a number of cuts per acre, or is that annual?
That's annual. On those farms, that was annual. Now that's dry matter.
Yep.
So their reported number was 15 per, I just said dry hay is customarily 15% moisture. And I backed it down to dry matter because I'm trying to get a comparative to pasture, and we're going to measure yield on pasture and dry matter. So $90 a ton with no land charge, with no owner's labor. Now, handling, storage, waste, and feeding waste and cost. If you look down below at the asterisk, I used the cost of moving the crop from the field to storage, and from storage to feeding off some custom rates that I found for 2020 in Wisconsin. And storage losses, to be fair to these inhibited crops, I used the lowest storage and feeding loss. And I'm going to show you a little more about this here in a minute. I used 5% for both. So there's about 10% loss, and I expressed it in increased cost of dry matter. But another way to do it is to understand that of the 3.8 tons of dry matter, 10% in this model is lost. So about 4/10 of a ton of dry matter is lost, which gets, if you're really good at storing and feeding, it gets the yield of hay that you actually get in an animal's mouth down in the 3 range, 3 something. That's a total cost. Now, I've got it to, therefore, we've taken dry matter out of the field, got it into an animal's mouth, $105. If you look at the cost per day, I got this thing inhibiting me, but I'll look. It's $100 a dollar. What is it? $1.31. I got something on my screen ahead of that. So anyway, all your beautiful pictures. Let's see if I can't get rid of that. Yeah, I did. Yeah, $1.31 a day.
Jim, quick question, just so I understand that the dry hay alfalfa line from all these farms, it's a whole range of feeding operations, or it's like a particular type of confinement operation? What's the range of variability on that?
That's really an interesting distinction here. These people that reported did not report whether they sold the hay or used the hay. But either they sold it and they used that as the price up on that top equation, or they used it and assumed a market price. That's how these crop budgets are sort of constructed. So I can't tell you whether every one of those 416 farms actually used their own hay. So if you look at total cost, total cash cost harvested, and draw a line, some of them then did have handling, storage, feeding, waste, and they fed their animals at $105 a ton of dry matter. Some of them simply sold the crop, and other people sustained the handling, feeding, etc. cost downstream.
But even if you're harvesting and selling, you're going to have some handling.
Oh yeah, you will. Yes,
and storage
and some waste. I mean, Undersander can tell you that there is waste, regardless. Yes. So the next thing I did was look at corn silage, and 467 farms reported to FinBin on corn silage. The yield, and you know, Brian McCullough and I tussle about this all the time. He loves corn silage, and he always says it's because he gets more dry matter off an acre. And in fact, he gets more dry matter off an acre, or at least these 467 farms did versus the ones that raised alfalfa. But the cost of those 467 farms got the cost per ton of dry matter up close to the hay number. There is no, the planting and establishment cost is obviously combined in the same year that you harvest. And so that $62.73 includes the cost of seed and fertilizer and so forth. And then so that runs across to total cash harvested, storage, handling, and waste is more because the tons are more, and those are done by a crank on tons, and the total consumed cost, feed in mouth of animal, $89.73, or $1.12 a day. Now, pasture. There is no database in Finbin for pasture. There is for set stock pasture, and it's rather dismal. The yield on, there were only 16 or 17 farms that reported. And of those 16 or 17 farms, the yield that they, in animal unit months that they reported was 2.4, 2.5 animal unit months per acre, which is set stock level consumption. So as I alluded to before, I did a study of 16 grass-fed beef farms. On those farms, I used the backing in method to figure out dry matter yield per acre. The average of those 16 farms was 2.4 tons of dry matter per acre. The best one was up around 3.5, and the worst one was about 1. And it was management and species, exactly the same things. I talked about yield variability. The cost on those farms, and this was a rigorous dump of every damn check they wrote, everything that they put into those pastures on an ongoing basis. This is not establishment. This is, and most of the pastures that I looked at, the farms I looked at, the pastures have been in place 4, 5, 10, 15, 25 years, something like that. Their average cost per acre was in the $50, $60 range. You divide that by the yield, and you're at on average $20.20. The worst one was 40, and it was horrible because of the way they were managing their animals. The best one was $10 per ton of dry matter. So I used the average. If you take the average, there is no handling, storage. The way that we measured consumption was to actually measure what was put in the animal's mouth. And so now out on the second to the 2 last columns, we are on an apples to apples basis between two harvested forage crops and the crop we call managed pasture. And it's $20 compared to $100, being kind to the waste part of that and of the corn silage. It works out to 25 cents a day versus $1.31 a day. Do the mental math. If you graze 180 days, let's say 200 to make it so I can do the math easily. Let's say you graze 200 days. The difference between the numbers, roughly speaking, is $1 a day difference between feeding harvested forage and feeding pasture. Right, the math is easy. 180, it's 180 days, it's $180 less per animal. $180 less per animal is the difference between profit and loss on the average cow-calf farm reporting to Finbin. And 180 days per, I'm sorry, $180 on a 1,000 pound soon to freshen dairy heifer is 10% of the average cost reported of raising dairy heifers, which is $1,800. And so this is a big deal. And this does not rely, by the way, on selling into a niche market at a higher price. This is conventional agriculture. Okay, I get carried away. Oh, and by the way, the bottom footnote, people see these and they say, oh, you're way high. we make hay for less than $66 a ton, way less. And I invite them to let me look at their numbers and put them into a tool that resides at the University of Wisconsin at that webpage called Livestock Compass. And that's exactly the tool I used when I did the benchmarking. And I will guarantee you that after we have a few, oh yes, but that's the number, oh no, but that's not, oh yes, it is, where else are you going to put it? We'll come to the fact that they're probably greater than the average, you know, like Wobegon, everybody's better than average. Okay, I just quickly want to show you some stuff I got from Dan Schaefer about storage loss on, and this is in the beef sector, so it's mainly dry hay. I won't read all this stuff to you, but look down here. A lot of people stack hay on the ground. I don't care what kind of, if you put a net wrapper on it, you might get a little bit less spoilage, but these are huge numbers, even for conventional storage shed. I bought hay last year from a conventional storage hay, and I will tell you, it was above 7% loss. If you look at the estimate of losses in feeding, depending on how you feed, these were done by an ag engineer that was looking at different kind of feeders, but I submit that if you feed on the ground, you could be up but on the ground without a bale ring or spread out, you could be up in these ranges too. And so those are the feed losses that were cranked in at the lowest level to my analysis. Okay, so cheap, but is it good? Yes. Thanks to Connor, I've had a real education because he educated himself in nutrients for animals and of feeds. I got from NRC that good alfalfa hay has this rack up of net energy for maintenance, net energy for growth, non-digestible fiber percentage, which is a negative issue, crude protein, and TDN. Actually, we got about 15 different nutrients, but I didn't want to make your eyeballs turn up in your head. So here's alfalfa, here's corn silage, and here's corn. Anybody that's been around a while says, yep, we understand that. Alfalfa hay is relatively low in both of the energy categories. It's high in protein, and that's the reason people beat the heck out of alfalfa by harvesting it pre-bud or in the bud stage to get the high protein, to mix with other things they're feeding, like corn silage and whole corn, which tend to be high in energy and low in protein. And so when you look at the dollars per day of those feed sources, not so much for alfalfa hay, but for corn silage, you have to realize that it isn't just corn silage that you would feed. That's a simplification I made in the comparison of the feed sources on the previous, the slide three or four behind or back, the numbers page. Whole corn is the go-to if you need to increase energy. If you look at managed pasture, Connor found at the University of Pennsylvania a huge data set called Dairy One that takes the results of samples that are sent into their lab. And I think, Connor, it's 20,000 samples of MMG. MMG is their category. It stands for mixed, mainly grass pasture. But the reason I put it up here is because their definition of mixed mainly grass allows up to almost 50% legumes, which is what we typically have in Wisconsin. But then there is a Wisconsin data point that I have from an experiment we did with UW Animal Science. Not an experiment is making it seem too exciting. It was a demonstration. We basically gave over the university 6 paddocks, and Ken Albrecht and Jeff Lemcooler picked a smooth leaf non-infected fescue to be interseeded in our existing paddocks, along with 2 white clovers. Koputu was a New Zealand white clover, fairly high yielding, high nutrient value white clover, which both of these were interseeded in pastures that had 4 or 5 different grasses and 3 or 4 different legumes already in them. And our energy, perhaps because of the emphasis on clover, because we have a lot of meadow fescue that tends to have a lot of digestible carbohydrates, our energy was not bad. It was, so it is doable to get a nutrient rack up off managed pasture that is in many ways better than alfalfa, a lot of ways better than corn silage alone, and same with whole corn. Now, what grazers have learned is that to pump up the energy, especially the energy for growth, you still, because you have very high protein in these kind of pastures, if you pump up, especially look at the dairy 1 megacalories per pound for growth is low. If you put corn in front of those animals, you pop that right back up and get a higher gain. So, okay, bottom line, managed pasture is good yielding, low cost, and high nutrient package. Good enough alone to support cow-calf, good enough alone to raise a dairy heifer, good enough alone to background a dairy steer, to keep a ewe flock together alone. Now, what do you do with it? And this is going to disappoint perhaps some of you. Going back to my view that farmers are artists, what I have done in the top part of this talk, down to this point, is to describe some tools, if you use the artist analogy, some colors, some paintbrushes that a farmer can use. There are so many different ways that the farmer can use it that we all should hesitate and say, no, we're not going to be prescriptive about how this wonderful crop is used. It's up to the farmer. But we can give them some ideas. And these are just screenshots off a spreadsheet that I put together. Look at dairy heifers, dairy heifer development. I looked at 300 farms in Finbin. The direct expense in row B, or column B, was dollars per day, $230 of those 300 farms. That's what it cost them. If you add in overhead, it was $260. About half of that was feed. Their feed cost per day was $1.27. And the total cost of raising that heifer up to right before freshening was $1,817. If you simply put those animals on a pasture for 180 days during that period, you would save the feed cost for those 180 days, or $189 a day. I'm sorry, a year, a grazing period, which takes the total cost of raising the heifer down to $16.27. The average lifespan of heifers in our CAFO industry in Wisconsin, not because they abuse the animals, I'm sorry, but because they want to improve genetics, because they don't rebreed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you take the $1,800 and amortize it over 3 years, there's a capital cost that must be sustained by a CAFO dairy of $600 a year on one of those animals. If you can raise the animal on grass and keep the same other cost, you could get that down to $1,627. But when I was at this meeting with the conservation crew, I talked to a guy that takes 100 heifers every year from an organic producer. Total cost to the producer, $1.35 a day. Total cost. If you compare that to the $2.60, now you've taken off $1, a little more. Right there, you've saved. And the grazer, if he is doing the same thing that I looked at these grass-fed guys, the cost, let's say he's up at $50 a ton. He is still making money. And so there's money to be made for the dairy heifer owner. There's money to be made for the grazer. And it saves the ultimate dairy operation on the amortization of the animal. I won't bore you with, there's hundreds of these things. That's the reason they're just little pieces out of a spreadsheet. If you look at 225 farms that did cow-calf and reported to FinBin, their direct expense for a calf was $667. Their direct and overhead expense was $815 average, the average. And on average, those 225 farms lost $6 per calf, believe it or not. The lowest 20% lost $535, and the highest yielding operations made $360. I can't tell from the numbers whether they used managed grazing or not. I doubt it. But they figured out how to raise animals cheaper. A huge management gap there between the high and the low. Of the grass-fed benchmark calves that I looked at, the average calf coming out of these FinBin farms was about 560 at weaning. The average weaning of the grass-fed farms was virtually unknown because they didn't weigh them. But just looking at the animals and how the animals finished, they had to be 550, something like that. So sort of a push. If you were forced into having nothing but grass, as the grass-fed beef farmers are, you could have saved $217 versus the average cow-calf farm. So as I said, I'm wandering off in an area we shouldn't even tread in, because every farm is its own farm and the farmer is the artist. Okay.
Jim, can we, are we getting close here? I want to leave some time for questions.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I've gone on too much.
It's all right.
There's assets, there's infrastructure, there's crop establishment. This is assets to get into managed grazing. Infrastructure, fence, pipelines. Grazescape will let us estimate these exactly to the farm we're looking at. And that's very important because there is no good average cost of infrastructure. We've done 8 or 9 farms in the Tainter Creek area. The least expensive one was like 200, and if you did it on an acre per acre basis, was like $220 per acre. The most expensive one was $1,800 an acre. So, and it's because of the configuration of the farms and many other things. Crop establishment, this is twofold. It's the seeds, it's any tillage you do, and it's nutrient addition of nutrients to bring the soil up to where it can perform to Alyssa's yield levels. Excuse me. There are ways to mitigate this. If, for instance, you transition hayland that has gone grassy into pasture, your establishment costs for those items are way lower. Equipment, a point I made to the guys there, Gene makes this all the time, I make it all the time. To be into grass-fed, any pasture system, if you don't make hay, you can get by with virtually no equipment. There's a guy down here that has 7,000 stockers on 2,000 acres of land. He's got 4 horses, a horse trailer, two or three ATVs, and that's it. Well, I can go on and on. There are people who have really squeezed their equipment asset down. Cattle, yes or no? The guy that takes 100 heifers every year from the dairy does not own cattle. So he has no asset cost in the cattle. And then land. I'll give you my viewpoint on land and then we're done. My viewpoint on land is this. Investors own land for the dominant reason, an investor, and actually if you'd scratch around, farmers own land for land appreciation. And an investor will say, I've looked at the data, I assume that there will be 5-6% appreciation on the farmland. That's the golden ring. I need enough annual income to cover the taxes and make a little profit. I'll live with 2 or 3%. That's how an investor looks at it. How a farmer looks at it is I'm going to put money in the land because that's my retirement plan. Both of those forces in the marketplace have forced land up, as has been, I see in the listserv here, it's true, that's forced it up. So trying to factor the cost of land into these crop budgets is a fool's errand because land, the cost of land varies by who you're talking to. But you have, that is the main asset of a farm. And so what I like to tell people to do is calculate all of your costs, your profit and loss without land. What you end up with on the bottom, before you do living cost and so forth, is the return to the land. Question, with that return to the land, can you rent it? With that return to the land, can you buy it? With that return to the land, are you building your retirement? And if the answer of any of that is no, then you got to go back and look at your production system. So that's how, the reason I took land out of the equation. It's very difficult to, and it's a cash expense if you rent. I'll give you that. If you
let's see, Jim, let's see if there's some questions or comments that people want to make.
Yep, you bet.